Before there were names, there were echoes. Not the kind that bounce back from stone walls, but those that drift in silence. Echoes that do not return because they were never spoken aloud. There's a kind of memory that predates language, that stirs beneath geology, beneath myth, beneath even the instinct for survival. It is not the memory of a personal life, nor of a civilization recorded and archived. It is older than parchment, older than bone, older than starlight caught in a telescope's lens. It is the echo before time, and still you have felt it, in moments of inexplicable longing, in dreams where you walk cities no historian has named, in the hush before a thunderstorm, in the tears you could never trace to a reason. There are things within you that no one taught you to feel, emotions that arrived without a source, like sunlight through a closed window. Perhaps you have mistaken them for imagination, but imagination, too, is a form of remembering. What if what we call history is not a complete narrative, but a selective silence? What if the most important chapters of this planet were whispered, not written, encoded not in monuments, but in the pulse of stone, the hush of oceans, and the dream language of the soul? We look for answers in the soil, but we rarely ask the soil itself. We excavate ruins, not revelations. And yet, some part of us remembers a time when the earth was not just inhabited, it was known, revered, spoken to, and it answered back, not in words, but in rhythm, in pattern, in cosmic alignment. Urantia, that is what they call this planet. Not Earth, not Terra, but Urantia, the soul name of a world whose story is still unfolding beneath our feet. Not the story of empires and armies, but the story of origin and fracture, of assignments given and forgotten, of divine emissaries who came not to rule, but to realign, who built cities like Dalmatia, now sunken, now whispered, not to dominate nature, but to dance with it. These are not myths. They are coordinates of remembrance, waiting for the soul to reorient itself. And in that remembering, a paradox arises. How is it that we long so deeply for what we never lived? Why do certain names, Lemuria, Atlantis, stir the heart like lost lovers, even though no textbook confirms them? What is this ache that surfaces when we hear of stars aligning or temples lost to tides? Could it be that the soul, unlike the body, does not obey chronology? That it keeps its own record, carved not in stone but in resonance? This book is not a theory, is not a dogma or an archaeological manifesto. It is a return to a conversation long interrupted, a quiet invitation to remember what you've never been told, not with your mind, but with something older, something sacred, something within you that has waited patiently for the silence to speak again. What modern science calls the Silurian hypothesis, the idea that a civilization may have existed millions of years before us and left behind no trace detectable by our current methods, is often treated as an intellectual curiosity, a playful exercise in scientific humility. But what if it is more than that? What if it is not merely a geological question, but a spiritual metaphor? What if the real value of the hypothesis is not whether it is provable, but whether it echoes something we already suspect deep within, that the amnesia we suffer is not only historical, but cosmic? We are a species obsessed with beginnings, yet terrified of the truth they may hold. We trace our lineages to apes, our nations to revolutions, our knowledge to the Enlightenment, as if light had not shone before that era. But beneath the crust of accepted history lies another possibility, not of advanced technology, but of advanced reverence, not of flying machines or laser tools, but of a different relationship with life itself, one where the earth was not a resource, but a relative, One where the human presence was not invasive, but initiatory. There are places where this older knowing still pulses. Göbekli Tepe, sealed deliberately beneath its own soil, like a message hidden not to deceive but to preserve. Baalbek, with its stones so immense they defy explanation, yet not violence. Enan Madol, rising from coral and basalt like the bones of a forgotten god. We call these anomalies, but perhaps they are not exceptions. Perhaps they are the last surviving syllables of a language the earth once spoke fluently, and we have only now begun to recall. We often think of evolution as ascent, from primitive to sophisticated, from cave to cathedral. But the soul does not evolve through accumulation. It evolves through resonance, through remembrance, through alignment with truths that do not change with time, because they precede it. The soul is not a hard drive storing data. It is a field of frequency tuned to echoes we can no longer hear, because we have forgotten how to listen. Carl Jung called it the collective unconscious, a realm beneath our personal memories, where ancient patterns still breathe. The Urantia Book speaks of a planetary prince who once walked this world in the days before history, and of a city named Dalmatia, now lost to the seas. Others speak of Lemuria, Atlantis, Mu, symbols perhaps, but symbols that tremble with familiarity. The more we try to dismiss them as fantasy, the more persistently they knock at the doors of our dreams. We live under the illusion that forgetting is freedom, that amnesia is evolution. But there is a cost to severing the thread. When we no longer know where we come from, we misinterpret where we are and stumble blindly toward a future that cannot hold us because we never anchored ourselves in the past. The earth remembers, even when we do not. And that memory is not a static archive. It is alive, waiting, humming just beneath the threshold of perception. The Urantia Book does not merely suggest alternative histories. It offers a map of planetary stewardship, of celestial administration, of missions forgotten, not because they failed, but because we lost the language to speak of them. Its pages do not argue, they remember. They are less instruction than invocation. To read them is not to be persuaded, but to be stirred, as one might be stirred by the scent of a place one never visited, yet somehow recognizes. It is not a book of doctrines, but of disturbances, holy ones, echoes made visible. And perhaps this is what Charles Eisenstein means when he speaks of the story of the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Not just a vision for the future, but a longing that predates time, a remembrance carried in the marrow of our species, beneath wars, beneath empires, beneath despair. A yearning for reunion, for reverence, for a world where mystery is not eradicated by knowledge, but amplified by it. A world in which science and spirit no longer war. But remember, they were never meant to be divorced. Carl Sagan once looked upon our pale blue dot and urged humility, not just because we are small, but because we are unknowing. And yet, that same dot is not empty. It holds all the memory we have buried. It cradles our beginnings and our betrayals. It remembers a time before time, a history not recorded in ink, but in silence, the silence between heartbeats, between stars, between now and never. It is a silence that aches to speak again. This work is not offered as proof, nor as prophecy. It is a mirror, not to reflect your face, but to reveal your remembering. You may find in these pages names you've never heard, places you've never walked, events that stretch the borders of belief. But if you read with the part of you that dreams while awake, the part that weeps when there is no tragedy, and hopes when there is no reason, you will not be lost. You will be returned to a knowing not taught, but inherited, to a resonance not imposed but remembered, to a wisdom that sleeps not in the stars, but in the soil beneath your feet, in the breath behind your breath, in the echo before time. Chapter 1. The silence beneath our feet. The ground has always seemed solid to us. We walk on it, build upon it, bury our dead in it, trusting without question that it will hold. But what if the earth beneath us is not merely substance, but scripture? Not merely mineral, but memory? Beneath every footstep, every root, every echo of thunder, there lies a silence deeper than sound, a stillness not empty, but dense with what has been forgotten. The crust of this planet is not dead stone. It is a veiled library whose books have no pages, only pressure. And we, the unknowing inheritors of its forgotten verses, rarely ask what it has chosen to hide. To speak of deep time is to disturb the linear comfort of history. It is to stretch one's imagination beyond the span of kings and wars, past pyramids and empires, into epics where human presence vanishes not because it never was, but because it has been folded into oblivion, subducted like tectonic memory into the molten hush. The continents move not only in space, but in silence. What they carry is not just stone, it is the weight of stories crushed into sediment, of civilizations reduced not to rubble, but to resonance. There is no marker for a culture buried by the earth's own breathing. There is no plaque for a temple dissolved by subduction. What disappears beneath the mantle leaves no trail for archaeologists, only a trembling in the mythic subconscious. And so we say there is no evidence. But absence of trace is not absence of presence. A song once sung into the wind may leave no fingerprint, yet still it shifts the current. What has gone beneath has not ceased to be. It has only changed form. Like grief, like intuition, like the soul's own history. The Urantia Book speaks of phases, planetary ages marked not only by geological events, but by spiritual inflections. It tells us that this world has been stewarded, visited, uplifted, and interrupted. But these events, like the stories of ancient rain, do not settle on the surface. They sink. They press themselves inward, downward, into the bones of the world and the bones of us. Perhaps that is why certain landscapes make us weep without understanding. Why caves feel like wombs. Why mountains humble us. It is not just grandeur we feel, but recognition of something that once was and still is beneath everything we've become. The earth forgets nothing, but it does not recall as we do, in linear words or carbon-sealed relics. It remembers through alignment, through pressure, through layered time. Each stratum is not just a slice of rock. It is a silent hymn, a timestamp in a language the body remembers, but the mind no longer speaks. And so, we walk unknowingly over what we ache to understand, mistaking stone for silence, forgetting that silence is often where the oldest voices hide. There is a rhythm beneath the soil, not audible to the ear, but perceptible to the soul. Geologists call it deep time, the incomprehensible chronology of the planet's becoming. But to the inward gaze, it is not merely a sequence of ages. It is a form of dreaming. The earth dreams downward, not upward. Its memories are pressed into silence, not broadcast into sky. In this silence, we may find a mirror, not for the intellect, but for the soul's own sedimented longing. Perhaps that is why the oldest rocks speak to something ancient in us, not because we evolved from them, but because we remember falling into them. Just as the Earth's crust conceals layers upon layers of compressed time, so too does the human psyche shelter strata of consciousness we rarely penetrate. Jung called it the collective unconscious, the underworld of the mind, where symbols grow roots, and archetypes sleep like seeds awaiting the right warmth to awaken. We dig into our past with tools of logic, hoping to exhume clean answers, but the deepest truths are not exhumed. They are intuited. They rise like water, not like fact. They rise when silence allows them to breathe. What we call subduction, the slow, invisible folding of one tectonic plate beneath another, is not merely geological. It is existential. Just as continents lose their memory to the heat below, we, too, bury truths too large or too luminous to hold. They do not disappear. They descend, and from that descent, they radiate unseen influence. Rupert Sheldrake speaks of morphic fields, resonant patterns that shape form and behavior beyond material causality. Could it be that forgotten epics, long subducted into the molten breath of earth, continue to whisper through us not as knowledge, but as instinct? The soul is not linear. It does not keep time like a clock, but like a cave, layered, echoing, sacred by its own silence. Heidegger spoke of being as time, not as succession, but as dwelling. To be is not to march forward through seconds. It is to inhabit mystery. And mystery does not rise above us. It holds beneath us. We are suspended over the abyss not of chaos, but of concealed memory. Not the kind that reminds, but the kind that rearranges. When you walk a mountain path and feel the inexplicable tear in your chest, or when you sit beside a river and hear nothing but still understand something, you're not hallucinating. You are intersecting with the silence beneath your feet. That silence is not void. It is song waiting to be recognized. You are not meant to understand it with your ears, but to remember it with your being. It is older than your thoughts and deeper than your bones. If the earth holds its memories in stone, then perhaps we, too, hold ours in places untouched by thought, in the spatial depths of soul where language fails and only reverberation remains. Gaston Bachelard once spoke of the poetics of space, how houses remember dreams, how corners cradle reverie, how every dwelling forms an inner geography. But the earth is the first house, the first temple, and beneath its crust lie not only tectonic plates, but the forgotten architectures of awe. When we forget the sacredness of place, we forget the sacredness of self. For we are not merely from the earth, we are formed in its likeness. In the book of Urantia, there are whispers of planetary ages, each one an unfolding drama of intervention and abandonment, of upliftment and rebellion. It speaks of Dalmatia, of the arrival of a planetary prince, of epics long submerged beneath the tides of forgetfulness. But what is myth if not memory encoded in symbol? What is revelation if not the soul remembering what the mind has never been taught? These are not stories to be proven. They are resonances to be felt, and the earth is the great resonator. We think of history as something that climbs upward, from primates to pyramids, from fire to flight. But perhaps history is not a staircase, but a spiral, and spirals do not ascend without also descending. The further we rise in intellect, the deeper we must root into mystery, lest we float away from meaning entirely. The ancients built with stone not to conquer time, but to ground memory. Their monuments were not only functional, they were mnemonic, containers of continuity, invitations to remember not only the sky above, but the silence below. We have not lost the past. We have buried it, in the earth and in ourselves. And what is buried does not die. It waits. It waits in dreams, in ruins, in intuitions that make no sense, but refuse to go silent. The deeper we listen, not to what is said, but to what is held, the more we begin to understand that silence is not absence. It is presence before sound, presence before story. It is the womb of all beginnings. To walk with reverence upon the earth is to walk upon the skin of a memory vast and unfinished. It is to tread softly on the pages of a book still being written. And every step becomes a prayer, not upward but downward, into the layers we forgot were sacred. For beneath our feet lies the soul of a world that never forgot us, even when we forgot ourselves. Chapter 2. Forgotten Civilizations, Remembered Souls. What if the greatest civilizations left no ruins? What if the most awakened cultures never carved their names in stone? Not because they lacked the skill, but because they lived by a rhythm that did not require monument. In a world obsessed with remnants, we assume that legacy is made of matter. But there's another kind of inheritance, one that breathes through intuition, not inscription, one that calls not from tombs or tablets, but from the inner architecture of the soul. The archaeologist seeks shards, structures, alignments. But the mystic seeks memory, not personal, but planetary. A memory that pulses through dreams and déjà vu, through inexplicable longings and the ache for a homeland never seen with physical eyes. Have you ever missed a place you've never visited? Grieved for a time that history never recorded? That sorrow is not delusion. It is remembrance. The soul is older than civilization, and sometimes it remembers what the world forgot on purpose. Urantia speaks of the Andites, the Nodites of Eden, and the beings who walked not only with knowledge, but with presence, who bore the remnants of celestial lineage not in bloodlines, but in frequency. These are not myths. They were stations in an unfolding cosmic symphony, not meant to be fossilized, but felt. Their disappearance from the historical record is not evidence of absence, but of another kind of existence, one not made for the eye, but for the spirit. To believe only in what can be excavated is to reduce the human journey to what survives destruction. But what if some civilizations were too attuned to be preserved in clay? What if their temples were woven from sound, and their teachings inscribed not on scrolls but in silence? We call it lost, only because we are deaf to the languages that do not echo in museums. These are not utopias of technology, but harmonies of being. Cultures not built to dominate, but to dwell, not to subdue the earth, but to dialogue with it. They did not see the cosmos as a riddle to solve, but as a beloved to behold. And in that beholding, they shaped no empires, but they seeded something deeper. The possibility that existence could be sacred without spectacle. There are whispers embedded in the architecture of the soul, echoes of civilizations not etched into the crust of the planet, but into the fabric of being. These were not cultures that built for permanence, but for resonance. Their existence was not defined by agriculture or metallurgy, but by frequency and awareness. They tuned themselves not to dominate, but to dissolve into alignment with the earth, with the stars, with the great rhythms that govern what we call time, but what they might have known as breath. The Urantia Book sketches silhouettes of these forgotten presences, Andites whose wisdom flowed from a mingling of terrestrial and celestial origin, Nodites whose knowledge carried traces of rebellion and grace, Edenic centers that shimmered like sanctuaries more than settlements. But these names, like all sacred names, are symbols. They point not only to peoples, but to potentials, blueprints of what civilization could be when rooted in soul rather than soil. When Rumi speaks of the soul that remembers God even when the lips forget, he gestures to the same territory, a culture of the heart that predates the hammer and survives the ruin. Henry Corbin's Mundus Imaginalis offers a compass here, a realm neither of fantasy nor of fact, but of imaginal truth. It is the place where archetypes live before they descend into history, where the soul converses with its own eternity before translation into flesh. Perhaps these civilizations, Lemurian, Andite, Edenic, never vanished. Perhaps they simply retreated into the imaginal, into the memory palace of being itself, awaiting the day when our awareness becomes subtle enough to meet them again. Not by digging, but by remembering. To feel the ache for a homeland that history denies is not pathology, it is prophecy. It is the soul's way of announcing that the stories we have inherited are not complete. Viktor Frankl called it the existential vacuum, that hollow grief not born from trauma, but from forgetfulness. We are not merely seeking meaning in our lives. We are seeking reunion with something that once sang through us and now only hums beneath our sorrow. This is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is a longing for what was. This is saudade, a longing for what should have been, for a way of living that the soul knows, even if the mind cannot recall. A civilization of communion rather than consumption. A memory not shaped by conquest, but by coherence. A sacred rhythm not bound to any land, yet belonging to the world entirely. The soul is the only archaeologist who can retrieve what never crumbled. It does not seek ruins, but roots. It does not brush away dust from forgotten objects. It breathes life into forgotten meanings. When we close our eyes and feel that ancient ache, we're not imagining the past. We are touching the threads that still pulse in the fabric of now, woven from eras that never ended, only turned invisible. The Lemurians are not lost beneath the Pacific. They may be alive within the oceanic depths of our own inner knowing. We call it myth to avoid responsibility for remembering. We label it fantasy because it cannot be carbon dated. But perhaps the oldest truths resist measurement precisely because they are not facts. They are frequencies. They are not found in the strata of stone, but in the strata of longing, in the tremble before sleep, in the unnameable joy upon hearing a melody that feels like home. These are the scrolls of a civilization not of hands, but of hearts. A civilization we still carry like a scar made of starlight. Urantia's unrecorded chapters hum beneath our modern distractions. Its tales of spiritual lineage and planetary stewards are not science fiction, but soul fiction. The fiction that tells the truth more fiercely than fact ever could. We're not the first to walk this earth with questions about who we are and where we belong. Others came before us, not only in body, but in brilliance. And they left no map, only a resonance. To remember them is not an act of intellect, but of intimacy. We do not need more discoveries. We need more discernment, the willingness to feel what logic cannot grasp, to sense what textbooks omit. The ancients may not return in form, but they are already rising in feeling. In the quiet revolution of those who turn from noise to nuance. In the soft rebellion of those who refuse to build towers and instead plant temples in their inner soil. This is how they survived. Not in ruins, but in remembrance. Not in monuments, but in murmurs. Not in what they left behind, but in what they left within us. Chapter 3. When evidence vanishes, mystery speaks. We have been trained to worship what can be proven, as if truth requires evidence to exist. But not all that is real leaves residue. Not all that is sacred fossilizes. The greatest architecture may be absence itself, an emptiness not of loss, but of invitation. For what vanishes does not always perish. Sometimes it ascends beyond detection, waiting to be felt rather than found. There are no ruins for certain civilizations because their wisdom chose evaporation over erosion. They were edited not by accident, but by intention, not erased, but hidden in plain silence. The earth, like a living manuscript, contains not only the words, but the white spaces that make meaning possible. To insist only on artifacts is to read without breathing, to seek answers without reverence. In those silences where archaeology shrugs, mystery kneels. The Urantia Book offers glimpses of revelations that arrive not with noise, but with unfolding. It speaks of epochs guided by beings who leave no monuments, only momentum. Truth in this model is not deposited, but revealed, and revelation is not a download, but a dawn. We are not receivers of finished messages, but participants in their emergence. And when something cannot be found, it does not mean it never existed. It may mean we are not yet still enough to see. Simone Weil wrote that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. But what she called attention was not focus, it was listening into the void. It was tuning the soul to what absence might be offering. When a sight disappears, when a relic disintegrates, when a record skips, that is the moment to stop analyzing and start adoring. The gap is not a flaw, it is a feature. It is a portal, and if we dare to dwell in it, it might not give us information, but it will give us transformation. Teilhard de Chardin, who saw evolution not just as biological but spiritual, spoke of the slow patience of God, a kind of cosmic waiting, where love refuses to hurry truth into clarity. In this view, mystery is not the enemy of knowledge. It is its womb. When the evidence retreats, the silence speaks, not in human language, but in something more primal, more faithful. It does not explain. It invites. There's a kind of sacred vanishing that is not disappearance, but transcendence. Like a melody that echoes long after the instrument is gone. There are truths that continue to shape us, even when their origins are untraceable. We do not mourn their loss. We kneel before their hiddenness. The absence itself becomes sacred, like the dark spaces between stars that make constellations possible. The soul does not fear what is missing. It remembers what was once whole. The earth, in its geologic silence, is more than a container of past civilizations. It is a living editor. Not everything that was said was meant to be kept in stone. Some truths, too delicate for permanence, were whispered into the soil, entrusted to the minerals, encoded in the breath between tectonic shifts. This is not the erasure of history. It is its encryption. The earth guards what we are not yet humble enough to receive. When archaeologists uncover a site and declare its age, they are not reading history. They are reading its remnants. But what about the meanings that never left traces? What about the civilizations that were not made of monuments, but of frequencies, of rituals without residue, of prayers that left no echo because they merged with the silence they invoked? These were not primitive omissions. They were advanced omissions, chosen invisibilities, a kind of reverence too high to cast a shadow. And what if the silences of the earth are not voids to be filled, but teachers to be followed? Gurdjieff taught that the highest truths cannot be spoken, that they lose their power when put into common words. This is not a dismissal of language. It is a sanctification of silence. The real questions in life are not answered. They are lived. And sometimes what we call ignorance is actually awe in disguise. It is a refusal to flatten the infinite into the finite. This is the pedagogy of the unseen. Doubt becomes not a threat to truth, but a gatekeeper of it, a sacred guardian, ensuring that only those who seek with sincerity, not certainty, may approach the threshold. The earth does not hide her treasures from us. She hides them for us until we are capable of receiving them without desecrating their depth. Mystery is not a placeholder for ignorance. It is a rhythm older than thought. It does not wait to be solved, but to be honored. In this new cartography of the sacred, absence is not a gap but a grammar. It teaches us how to read the world not as a compilation of knowns, but as a revelation unfolding. Like a poem that only completes itself when spoken aloud in solitude. The deeper truths of our planet do not reside in discovery. They reside in the dignity of not being rushed. What the Urantia Book dares to suggest is that revelation is not a single event, but an evolutionary unfolding, a sacred pedagogy that releases wisdom at the rate our souls can absorb it. This is the divine patience Teilhard de Chardin so beautifully saw in the cosmos, an intelligence that doesn't impose but invites. And where it seems nothing has been left behind, we are being asked to stop digging and start listening. Simone Weil believed that attention, the kind that stretches beyond the senses, was the soul's greatest gesture of love. In the presence of the unseen, she taught us to be still, not because there is nothing to be found, but because that which is coming to us cannot be approached through conquest. It must be welcomed through consent. And so, when the world goes silent, when a sight disappears or a record fades, perhaps what is truly happening is not erasure, but elevation. The truth is not vanishing. It is rising out of reach until we rise with it. The earth does not punish us with mystery. She protects us with it. She delays revelation not as judgment, but as grace, to teach us that what cannot be proven may still be known, not by the mind, but by the whole being. We were never meant to just analyze our layers. We were meant to remember what we once knew in them. For beneath our feet and within our hearts, the same silence speaks. And if we are still enough, it will say everything. Chapter 4. The Soul as a Seismograph. There are tremors that do not shake the ground, but quiver the silence within. Long before science built instruments to detect seismic shifts, the soul was already recording tremblings not of tectonic plates, but of forgotten truths stirring in the substratum of being. We are not just biological descendants of an evolving planet. We are sensorial inheritors of a spiritual geology, born into bodies that remember more than their DNA dares to admit. Beneath our ribs, there is a sensor older than memory, quieter than thought, and more precise than reason: the soul. It registers not only what happens, but what almost happened. It quakes with presences that never arrived, and weeps for civilizations we never saw yet somehow mourn. Every inexplicable longing, every dream that feels like a return rather than a creation, is a tremor from a depth no map can reach. Like an ancient fault line buried under a modern city, these memories run beneath the stories we tell ourselves, surfacing not in artifacts, but in ache. Carl Jung spoke of archetypes not merely as symbols, but as living vessels of collective experience, echoes of something vast encoded in the softest moments. The shiver of déjà vu, the inexplicable sorrow upon hearing a song for the first time, the pull toward places we've never been. These are not accidents of psyche. They're the soul's tectonic murmurs. We call them intuition, but they are more than feeling. They are fragments of an ancient knowing, left behind not in stone, but in sensation. And if we listen not just with ears, but with essence, we begin to sense that much of what we consider spiritual is actually geological in origin, not in the sense of rock and sediment, but of layers of being compressed and folded by eras of incarnation and forgetfulness. Our souls are not blank slates, but palimpsests, rewritten over lifetimes, yet still bearing the pressure marks of ages long submerged. In this sense, to feel deeply is not weakness, but witness. It is the sacred duty of a being still attuned to the deeper vibrations of reality. the ones that never made it into the history books, but carved themselves into the human heart. The language of the soul is not one of chronology, but of resonance. It doesn't speak in dates or artifacts, but in pulses, sudden knowing, inexplicable grief, moments of serene familiarity in unknown places. These are not coincidences. They are the soul's seismic patterns, revealing the echoes of realities so ancient and refined that they leave no trace except in the shape of our longings. A dream where you understand a forgotten language. A vision of a city that has no coordinates, but you know its every street. A name you've never heard, yet it feels like it once belonged to you. These are not fictions, they are tremors. There is an entire psychology of the sacred that cannot be measured by conventional instruments. Depth psychology, as touched by Jung and expanded by Hillman, moves not toward diagnosis, but toward remembering. The idea that the soul contains more than our personal biography, that it is connected to an imaginal realm, a kind of spiritual ecosystem, aligns with what the ancients understood intuitively. They did not differentiate between inner and outer worlds, between memory and myth. For them, the world was soul-infused, and the soul was world-shaped. Somewhere between these dimensions dwell the midwayers, invisible agents of alignment, described in the Urantia Book not as gods or ghosts, but as translators between frequencies. They do not exist to intervene, but to interpret. They are like subtle winds through the corridors of thought, reminding us that not all intelligence wears a body, and not all presence casts a shadow. When you feel guided without reason, when insight arrives not through logic but through stillness, it may be their silent hand brushing against your perception. Such moments cannot be proven, only lived. They are invitations rather than instructions. The deeper layers of soul awareness are not built through doctrine, but through attention, the kind of presence that mystics like Inayat Khan called listening to the silence. This is not about withdrawal from the world, but about entering it more wholly. To listen with the soul is to become a seismograph for the invisible, registering the tremors of a forgotten Eden, the size of a civilization that once aligned itself with the breath of stars. Perhaps this is why certain truths cannot be taught. They must be remembered, not through intellect, but through inner vibration. The soul does not receive knowledge the way the brain does. It awakens through recognition, like the way a forgotten melody stirs tears long before you realize you've heard it before. This is the domain of archetypal memory, a realm Jung touched with reverent caution, knowing it was less a psychological model than a spiritual terrain. In those depths, memory is not stored, it is alive. The past does not rest. It breathes through symbols, sensations, and subtle disruptions in the surface of waking life. These disruptions are not problems to solve. They are thresholds, a recurring dream, an inexplicable anxiety, a longing with no object. They are signs that something ancient is knocking, not from the outside, but from beneath. Not to frighten, but to remind. The myths of Lemuria, of vanished continents and spiritual ages, may not be historical in the empirical sense, but they are profoundly accurate in another register. Their truth lies not in geography, but in resonance. They mirror states of being the soul once knew and perhaps longs to reclaim. Midwayers, as described in the Urantia text, operate between these frequencies, not as entities of hierarchy, but as witnesses of memory. They hold fragments of planetary history too subtle for carbon dating, too luminous for stone. They do not need temples. They dwell in moments of deep intuition, in the trembling before a revelation, in the soft certainty that something sacred is near. Their whispers may reach us in meditation, in dreams, or even in the sudden urge to protect a place, a story, or a stranger. They are not saviors, but signalers, pointing not to themselves, but to the thresholds we have forgotten how to cross. And so the soul, in its truest state, is not a passive vessel, but a sensitive receiver, a seismic instrument of divine design, capable of registering what the world dismisses. It does not wait for confirmation from the outer world, for it knows that by the time the outer confirms, the inner has already moved on. This is not madness, it is mysticism. It is what the world once called prophecy, or vision, or simply wisdom. And it is returning, not as dogma, but as remembrance, not to warn us of the end, but to remind us that beneath the layers of history, beneath the dust and sediment, there is a pulse still beating. And it is not of stone, it is of spirit. Chapter 5, Whispers of Dalmatia. There are places that vanish without leaving ruins, yet their whispers remain in us like a memory that refuses to die. Dalmatia is one such place, not a city merely of stone and order, but the first breath of spiritual structure upon a still young world. Before the pyramids, before fire was harnessed by tribes scattered across continents, there was Dalmatia, not in the sense of chronology, but in the realm where myth and memory are the same. It was not merely a city. It was the prototype of divine intention rooted in matter, where the invisible made its first attempt to walk among the visible. To speak of Dalmatia is not to invoke nostalgia, but to uncover a pattern, the cycle of light descending, being distorted, and the long ache to recall its form. The Urantia Book tells of Caligastia, the planetary prince, who is entrusted with the sacred task of guiding early humanity toward light. Yet even celestial appointments are vulnerable to pride, and the rebellion that followed was not simply a celestial drama. It became an archetypal wound, echoing through the psychic architecture of our species. The betrayal was not of humans alone, but of the planet itself, a rupture in the bridge between heaven and earth. And yet, it was not a total erasure. The soul remembers in symbols what the mind cannot hold. Dalmatia is no longer on the map, but it lingers in our myths of fallen cities, in the stories of golden ages lost due to hubris, in the collective suspicion that we once lived closer to the gods. These are not fantasies. They are encrypted recollections, dreams drawn from the soul's deeper strata, what Ignacio Mat Blanco might call the unconscious structured in symmetrical logic, where time collapses and what once was still is. These impressions are not imagination run wild, but the architecture of ancient truth embedded in psychic fiber, waiting only for the right silence to emerge. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote that the future enters us long before it happens. In the same way, the past survives in us long after it disappears. And some pasts, like that of Dalmatia, do not disappear at all. They transform into whispers, dreams, strange certainties, inexplicable longings for cities we have never seen but know in our bones. The fall of Dalmatia was not just the fall of a place. It was the first great dissonance between spirit and civilization. It set the tone for a world that would forget in order to remember, that would lose Eden over and over, only to build temples to its idea. The fall of Dalmatia was not abrupt. It was a slow dimming, a quiet unraveling of light that once pulsed steadily in the soul of the world. When Caligastia turned from the divine harmony and chose his own will over cosmic alignment, it was not a loud rebellion. It was a subtle shift in vibration, and that is perhaps why its echo continues to ripple through us. For when spirit fractures, it does not shatter. It resonates through all that once touched it. Dalmatia became a ghost, not because it was destroyed, but because its frequency could no longer hold form in a world whose foundation had been betrayed. And yet, the earth did not forget. The land remembers, even if the mind does not. There are regions beneath seas, beneath sediment, beneath centuries of disbelief, where the silence is too exact to be empty. Somewhere under the silt of history lies not just the stones of Dalmatia, but the vibration it once held. And we, those who walk with an unnamed ache, with the sensation that something is missing but cannot be named, we carry its whisper. It is a sacred burden to feel nostalgia for what has no date, no location, no photograph. A nostalgia that lives not in memory, but in intuition. Ivanhoe spoke of civilizations that fall, so their essence might rise. This paradox of descent that gives birth to ascension is the hidden logic of all spiritual unfolding. The betrayal of Dalmatia was not an end, but a planting. A seed buried in the unconscious of humanity, destined to break through the surface of time when the soul matures enough to recognize its own echo. The fall, then, was not a punishment, but a preparation, a necessary veiling, so that we might one day choose to remember rather than be told. True wisdom, after all, is not inherited, it is remembered through fire. In this sense, Dalmatia never ceased to be. It became archetype, vibration, myth, and myth, as we know, is not less than history. It is its inverse, its shadow twin, its spiritual reflection. It is how truth survives in exile. We do not need to find ruins to prove that Dalmatia existed. The ruins are in our myths of golden cities swallowed by waves, in the recurring dreams of a world that knew peace before language, in the ache we feel when we see a sunset and sense that something within us once lived closer to the source. Dalmatia is the myth that refuses to be forgotten, because it is not a myth, but a whisper awaiting recognition. We are not merely descendants of biological evolution. We are inheritors of interrupted revelations. Dalmatia was not simply a location on the map of Urantia. It was a tone in the symphony of soul evolution. And although its buildings dissolved into the ocean and its streets faded from memory, the spiritual resonance it once carried remains suspended in the field of the collective unconscious. Jung called it the archetype, the psychic imprint of what once was and what could be again. But it is more than psychology. It is a coded message sent forward through time, awaiting those with ears tuned not to proof, but to presence. This is why some among us dream of oceans parting to reveal cities of light. Why children sometimes speak of places they've never read about, with names that taste of salt and stars. Why there is a yearning that no career, no possession, no romance can ever quite soothe. We're trying to remember something that the intellect cannot hold, because it was never held by thought, but by being. Dalmatia whispers to us not in language, but in ache. It comes in the quiet after grief, in the stillness after prayer, in that inexplicable moment when we feel we've lost something ancient that was never ours in the first place. And perhaps that is its purpose, not to be found, but to be felt, not to be reconstructed in stone, but reawakened in soul. For what fell must rise, not by force, but by resonance. And those who carry the seed of remembrance, the poets, the mystics, the children who see with unclouded eyes, are the gardeners of that resurrection. The whisper of Dalmatia is not a call to return, but a call to continue, to take what was sacred and shattered, and allow it to sprout again in the fertile soil of this new age. For the fall of Dalmatia was never just a fall. It was a gesture of trust that someday, somewhere, someone would remember not the facts but the feeling. and through that remembrance, rebuild not the city, but the soul it once reflected. Chapter 6, The Covenant of Eden. There are myths that never died because they were never born from imagination. They were whispered into the soul like lullabies from a time before time. Eden is one of these, not a garden with borders, but a vibration of balance, a covenant of resonance between the visible and the invisible, the clay and the breath. It is not behind us, but beneath us, within us, like a dream that insists on returning through every act of love, every longing for peace, every tear shed over the world's fragmentation. In the book of Urantia, Eden is not a punishment-laden fable, but the seed of a divine intention, a cosmic attempt to anchor spiritual harmony into a physical realm. And like all seeds, it was buried, not lost. Adam and Eve did not arrive to condemn, but to cultivate. Their mission was not to restart humanity, but to realign it. They came bearing frequencies of beauty and order, carriers of a celestial template meant to recalibrate a world still echoing the dissonance of Dalmatia's fall. Eden then was not simply a garden. It was the first great experiment in conscious co-creation between celestial and terrestrial intelligences. But Earth, or Urantia, was not yet ready to receive such an alignment without resistance. The soil of history was still tangled with the roots of rebellion, and the covenant, though offered in purity, was fractured by the very volatility it came to heal. And yet, the myth endures, not because it was fulfilled, but because it still lives within the ache of its incompletion. The fall of Eden is not merely the end of innocence. It is the beginning of memory. A collective amnesia was born that day, not as punishment, but as veil. And beneath this veil, a sacred nostalgia pulses, not for a place, but for a state of being. That is why the story persists across cultures, reshaped by tongues and times, but always carrying the scent of something sacred, something lost. It is not about a serpent or an apple. It is about the moment we chose experience over essence, and the soul's lifelong yearning to return, not backward but inward. The biblical retelling of Eden veiled more than it revealed. Over centuries, the sacred narrative that once encoded the vibration of a planetary covenant was clothed in moralism and shame. A serpent became sin, a woman became guilt, and the exile became punishment. But beneath that distortion lies the original code, Eden not as an origin myth, but as a map to wholeness. The fall was not an expulsion, it was a divergence from resonance. A note out of tune in the grand symphony of spiritual evolution. And in that dissonance, humanity began the long and beautiful journey of remembering what was never truly lost. Adam and Eve, as portrayed in the Urantia revelation, were not the first humans, but celestial emissaries, biological uplifters carrying within their being the harmonics of higher worlds. Their mission was interrupted, not failed. Their error was not betrayal, but acceleration. They tried to bridge the chasm of consciousness before the soil was fertile for such awakening. And yet, their essence remains. Their presence lingers in our myths, in our genetic longing for beauty, in the ache for a paradise that feels more like a memory than a story. That ache is not weakness. It is spiritual fidelity. Every civilization carries within its unconscious the myth of a golden age, a time when humanity walked in harmony with the divine, when the earth responded to the voice of spirit and the heart of man was not yet divided. Gnostic whispers called it the pleroma, the fullness before fracture. Jung called it the archetype of the self, the undivided psyche. Clarissa Pinkola Estes described it as the wild soul, instinctively whole, unashamed, close to the source. Eric Newman saw in it the memory of the Great Mother, not just a figure, but a field of inner unity. And all these visions speak of Eden, not as past geography, but as eternal invitation, a call to retrieve the thread of harmony within chaos, to hear the ancient covenant still humming beneath the noise of time, to remember Eden is not to seek its physical return, but to reestablish the covenant it represented, a sacred agreement not written in stone, but encoded in the silence between heartbeat and breath. The first garden, as Urantia describes, was more than geography. It was architecture of intention. It was the spiritual topology of what the world could become when spirit and matter dance in balance. The fall of Adam and Eve was not the end of that covenant, but the seed of its transformation. In falling, they placed in our hands the task of rising. In forgetting, they passed on the secret of remembering. The failure was never final. It was the beginning of a pilgrimage toward wholeness. Eden lives in every longing for beauty without possession, for peace without conquest, for love without condition. It breathes in the child who speaks to trees, in the dream that feels more like a return than a vision, in the pause before a sacred act when time itself seems to yield. This is not nostalgia. It is resonance, a frequency still active beneath the static of civilization. And each generation, knowingly or not, listens for it. The covenant of Eden is not broken. It is unfinished. It waits not for redemption, but for reactivation, a reawakening of what was always seated in the spiritual DNA of humanity. The soul remembers not only what was, but what was meant to be. And that memory, though often buried beneath trauma and tradition, still pulses beneath the surface. The promise of Eden was not comfort, it was coherence. A world where the inner and the outer mirror each other, where the voice of God and the voice of the earth speak in unison. That dream has not died. It has merely gone underground, like a river beneath stone, waiting for the soil to soften, the silence to deepen, the listener to return. And when we do, not as exiles, but as keepers of the covenant, we will find that Eden was never behind us. It was always a future written in the memory of the soul. Chapter 7. The Geometry of Forgetting. There is a pattern to the silence, a rhythm to what vanishes, a sacred symmetry behind the erasures of time. Forgetting, though cloaked in absence, is not random. It follows laws older than memory itself, geometric, precise, mysterious. The earth, as a living mandala, does not lose what it cannot use. It buries what is not yet ready to be seen, encodes what the soul must remember in dreams, and reshapes knowledge as myth until the mind evolves enough to bear the truth. The geometry of forgetting is not destruction, but gestation, a spiritual calculus that bends the arc of revelation in spirals, not lines. Each lost civilization, each erased symbol, each crumbled truth is not merely gone. It is folded, like a sacred text wrapped in fire and earth, waiting for hands not yet born. In the vast architecture of planetary consciousness, memory is not linear. It is layered, recursive, sometimes encrypted within the very mechanisms that seem to obscure it. The Urantia Book whispers of progressive revelation, where epics are not stages of forgetting, but spirals of refinement. The truths we forget are often the ones we are not yet willing to integrate. And so the soul conspires with time, not to conceal, but to prepare. Time itself is not indifferent. It is an editor with divine intuition. It cuts not with cruelty, but with care, trimming what cannot yet be grasped and elongating what must be endured. We imagine time as erosion, but it is also sculpture. What appears to have been wiped away may in truth have been transformed into symbols, dreams, and synchronicities. The forgetting of whole ages, of whole races, may be less a loss than a sacred pause, a breath taken by the cosmos before speaking again. René Guénon spoke of sacred geometry as the language of the divine. If so, then forgetting is the space between syllables, a necessary silence in the sentence of becoming. The collective mind of the planet dreams in patterns. Beneath the surface of what we call history lies a deeper stream, an unconscious river where symbols drift and reconfigure themselves across generations. Jung called it the collective unconscious, a psychic substratum where the myths of the forgotten continue to breathe, silently influencing civilizations that believe themselves original. This shared mind does not forget in the way individuals do. It stores, disguises, and represents. It cloaks truth in archetype, hiding the real behind the symbolic until we are ready to receive the undiluted memory. Every repression in psychology has its mirror in history. What the ego cannot assimilate, it buries. What a culture cannot endure, it mythologizes and then forgets. But forgetting, in this higher sense, is not dysfunction. It is protection. It is orchestration. The mind, like the earth, performs a sacred curation, releasing only what will not destroy, unveiling only what will initiate. The lands once sacred are now shopping malls, the temples of the ancients replaced by data centers. But the soul does not forget the vibration of sanctity. There is an ache in modern life, an unplaceable hunger, a ghost of remembrance for something we cannot name. This ache is not nostalgia. It is spiritual architecture calling us home. The sacred is not gone. It is hidden beneath layers of perception, behind veils shaped by time, fear, and pride. Donald Hoffman posits that our senses evolved not to perceive reality, but to navigate usefulness, that what we see is interface, not essence. If so, then what is buried is not lost, only filtered. The earth is not silent. We have simply forgotten how to hear her. She speaks in alignments, in fractures, in dreams, and anomalies. The mandala of forgetting is not flat. It is dimensional, coded in frequencies and echoes. Its purpose is not erasure, but initiation. The geometry does not lie in the lines we see, but in the voids between them. And those voids are alive. René Guénon spoke of sacred geometry not merely as art or symbol, but as the very language through which the divine shapes time and space. If the earth forgets and spirals, if civilizations fall not into nothingness, but into fractals of memory waiting to be reassembled, then perhaps the past is not behind us. It is all around us, folded into the present like light in a prism. The spirals of forgetting are not disorder, but preparation. Just as the seed forgets the tree, so it may grow anew. So too do worlds forget their origins, so they may rediscover them freely, not as inheritance, but as revelation. The Urantia Book reminds us that evolution is progressive and purposeful. What appears as decay is often a recalibration. What looks like loss may be spiritual conservation. The planet does not bury its truth. It embeds it in the folds of geology, in the grooves of myth, in the chambers of our unconscious, and the symmetry of forgotten cities now seen only from the sky. And when a soul is ready, not intellectually, But vibrationally, these truths rise like buried seeds sensing the rain. They do not arrive through logic. They emerge through resonance. We are not wandering through a broken history. We are moving through a perfectly timed labyrinth of remembrance. Each shadow cast by time is a necessary veil, softening the light until our eyes are ready to see again. What was lost was never discarded. It was preserved in silence, guarded by angels, encoded in dreams. The sacred pattern of forgetting is not an erasure. It is a spiral staircase, invisible until stepped upon, each turn bringing us closer to the memory we mistook for longing. The earth remembers us, and she is waiting. Chapter 8, The Midwayer's Vigil. There are sentinels who do not sleep, not because they lack fatigue, but because their covenant is older than time and their mission older than memory. The Urantia Book names them midwayers, beings neither of flesh nor of pure spirit, but of a nature that defies linear definition. They dwell between dimensions, standing at the threshold where matter begins to dissolve into meaning. They are not legends, but legacies, not myths, but the architecture beneath myth. And though the world seldom speaks of them, their fingerprints remain, in dreams that feel more like instructions, in warnings that arrive as a whisper, in strange recognitions between strangers whose souls remember having stood beside them before. They're the bridge between what is seen and what insists on remaining unseen. The first humans walked among them unknowingly, just as we, today, pass by echoes of them in the folds of our perception. They are the witnesses of the long forgetfulness, the custodians of a memory the earth is still learning to carry. Some say they guard the ruins of Dalmatia and Eden not with weapons, but with frequency, protecting not stones but meanings. They are the living archivists of an invisible history. Their task is not to intervene, but to vibrate, to hold the resonance of what was true before it was buried beneath timelines and dogmas. William Blake spoke of angels hiding in plain sight, in the lines of trees and the corners of children's eyes. The midwayers are such angels, not winged but luminous in other ways. They are the intermediaries of remembrance, ensuring that no truth is ever truly lost, only veiled, only sleeping. Their touch is never direct, but it is unmistakable to the soul that is listening. We call them coincidence, déjà vu, the unexplainable warmth before a decision that saves us. We dismiss their voices as intuition, never knowing that intuition is often conversation we didn't realize we were having. To understand the midwayers is not to catalog them, but to sense the frequencies they hold in trust. According to the Urantia revelation, they were born not of celestial command alone, but of a planetary necessity, a response to the need for a link, a thread that could be felt when the divine seemed too far and the human too dense. They walk between worlds not because they are lost, but because we are. They remember for us what we have forgotten for ourselves. Their labor is not of spectacle, but of stewardship, where humans write with words and spirits move through light. The midwayers speak in resonance, echoing truths through dreams, warnings, and moments of irrational peace. They're the archaeologists of consciousness, not digging in sand but in the soul. Where stone ruins fail, they preserve the vibration of wisdom. They are not concerned with what was built, but with what was meant. Their vigilance is a melody beneath the world's noise, the soft murmur that tells a weary seeker, "You are not alone." Their presence is often mistaken for the inexplicable calm before catastrophe is averted, the dream that prevents a fatal step, the number sequence that repeats until we finally stop and listen. They do not force us to awaken. They sing near our sleep. Invisible, Yes, but never absent. They are the intermediaries of grace. Rudolf Steiner would have called them elemental beings of a higher octave, agents of spiritual ecology who ensure that the evolution of a planet does not forget its origin. In the same breath, Tom Berg might have recognized them as silent collaborators of the archangelic hierarchies, tasked with keeping alive the spiritual contract that preceded matter. Their role is not salvation, but remembrance. And in a world that has confused noise with presence and visibility with reality, their gift is the restoration of subtlety, the sacred art of being heard without being seen. To encounter a midwayer is not to see, but to sense. It is the shift in wind when no window is open, the tingling in the spine just before clarity dawns, the synchronicity that breaks logic to reveal meaning. They walk beside us in the borderlands of thought, emotion, and intuition, agents of the invisible kingdom that remains loyal to divine order even as the material world forgets its own. They are not guardians of history as it is recorded in books, but of memory as it is recorded in vibration. They remember what the soil has buried and what the human heart has chosen to suppress. And their remembrance is active. The midwayers are not passive custodians, but collaborators in the great unfolding of planetary consciousness. In the symphony of spiritual evolution, they are the notes between the notes, inaudible to most, yet essential for harmony. They inspire artists, whisper through poets, nudge scientists toward discoveries they cannot explain, and soothe prophets in their darkest hours of doubt. William Blake, with his piercing visions, painted them not in names, but in presences, the unseen angels that illuminate the threshold of perception. These are the beings who hold the lamps when our torches fail. But to work with them is not to command, and to seek them is not to summon. The collaboration between human souls and midwayers is governed by resonance, not authority. It requires humility, not demand, openness, not technique. They come not because we call, but because we listen. Their messages are carved in silence, and only those who dwell in inward stillness can decode them. They are not proof of the supernatural, but reminders of the natural that we have forgotten is sacred. As long as a single soul on earth still remembers that not all truth is visible, the midwayers will remain, waiting, guiding, and holding vigil over the memory of paradise, the promise of restoration, and the pulse of eternity hidden in time. Chapter 9. Civilizations of Light, Lost to Sight. There are civilizations that left no ruins, no pottery, no tools rusting beneath the sand. Only echoes, only frequencies that hum beneath the skin of the world. Civilizations woven not of stone or bronze, but of silence, intention, and sacred geometry. Their temples were made of thought. Their cities were mapped in dreams. Their scriptures were encoded into the very fabric of vibration. These are not civilizations you will find marked by carbon dating or in dusty museum displays, for their essence cannot be fossilized. They existed beyond the grasp of time, and yet their memory persists, not in the soil, but in the soul. The Lemurians, whispered through legend, were not merely an ancient people of land and sea, but carriers of a consciousness calibrated to the rhythms of nature and the breath of stars. They did not conquer the earth, they communed with it. And when the tides of planetary evolution shifted, they did not vanish, they diffused, dissolving into the invisible fields of resonance that still wrap around the earth like a spiritual atmosphere. Some say they live now as memory within us, waiting not to be rediscovered archaeologically, but to be remembered inwardly. Not through excavation, but through inner awakening. And what of the Andites, that mysterious lineage described in the Urantia papers, bridging Adamic ancestry with mortal evolution. They were not simply carriers of genetics, but transmitters of light. Their migrations were less about geography and more about the seeding of soul codes, embedding fragments of divine ideals in the cultural DNA of early human tribes. Where they walked, languages grew like flowers. Where they touched, myths were born. They were not gods, but midwives of memory, invoking within humanity a vision of what could be, not through dogma, but through inner stirring. Their legacy is not buried. It is blooming within those who dare to listen to the quiet tremors beneath modern identity. To the eyes of history, these civilizations do not exist. But to the soul, they never stopped whispering. They move through us like ancestral winds, stirring inexplicable longings, irrational recognitions, déjà vus with no logical anchor. The forgetting was external. The remembering is internal. For how could one fossilize a song sung in the language of stars? How could carbon date the compassion of a people who healed with their presence or navigated with the intuition of whales? These are not the lost cities of gold, but the living sanctuaries of resonance. Their ruins are not in deserts, but in forgotten dreams, their maps drawn not with ink, but with longing. The wisdom they seeded was not meant to build empires, but to water the spirit. It was a transmission beyond alphabet, beyond tongue, a vibrational teaching encoded into the crystalline lattice of the earth and echoed in the subtle architecture of the human nervous system. That is why some feel a pull to certain mountains, rivers, or constellations without knowing why. It is not nostalgia for a place, but for a state of being. It is the soul remembering a time when it was seen not as a byproduct of biology, but as the compass of a civilization. There is no archaeological method precise enough to detect the pulse of a civilization that chose silence as its signature. The Lemurians knew that what is built in stillness endures beyond structure. The Andites whispered prayers into genetics, and other unnamed cultures, not even hinted at in scrolls or scripture, moved like myths through the dark corridors of time, leaving no evidence, only impact. The sacred is not always spectacular. Sometimes it moves so gently that only the heart feels it. These civilizations were not lost. They became light. To remember them is not to uncover ruins, but to awaken a vibration. They left no statues because they sculpted in consciousness. They had no hieroglyphs because they wrote in frequency. They governed not through law, but through alignment. They healed not through remedy, but through presence. Their temples were built of sound, their mathematics encoded in breath, and their architecture aligned with the inner sky. These were civilizations that trusted the soul more than the sword, and intuition more than instruction. And yet, in this current era of noise and machinery, their echoes still rise in subtle forms. In the child who hums melodies not learned, in the elder who weeps before the ocean without knowing why, in the dreamer who draws symbols she's never studied. The forgetting was never complete because the human soul is not a closed archive, but a living seismograph. We are walking ruins of the sacred, and in the ruins, life still speaks. The Andites were not only travelers, they were carriers of an invisible grammar. The Lemurians did not disappear. They dissolved into the ether, leaving their footprints in the auric field of the planet. The mystery schools of the past were not built for elite initiates, but for any being willing to sit in stillness and listen. And even now, when one enters deep silence, when one lets the thinking mind sleep and the inner ear open, one might feel them, not as ghosts of the past, but as collaborators of the present. For civilizations of light were never meant to be remembered intellectually. They were meant to be relived energetically. And perhaps that is the secret, not to excavate them from the earth, but to resurrect them in ourselves. Every act of kindness rekindles a lost city. Every moment of stillness is a bridge to Lemuria. Every decision made from the soul, and not from fear, is a stone set back into the foundation of an inner Eden. We are not just descendants of these civilizations. We are the continuation of their prayer. And though they may have vanished from sight, they were never lost to the light. Chapter 10. What the oceans still remember. The ocean does not speak as we do. It murmurs in tides, dreams in currents, and remembers in waves. Unlike the earth, it does not fossilize its history into bones and stones. It sings it, it vibrates it, it dissolves it into fluidity, not to forget, but to preserve without rigidity. For memory in water is not linear. It is circular, spiraling, returning, recurring. And when we walk by its edge or float in its silence, something ancient in us stirs, something not quite personal, not quite historical, but undeniably real. The oceans remember what the land has long buried beneath layers of forgetfulness. The surface of the planet may have changed its face countless times, shifting continents like dreams shifting form, but the waters have always remained close to their essence. The ocean is Earth's first consciousness made manifest, the amniotic cradle from which not only biology, but myth was born. Before the stories were spoken, they were whispered into the deep. Before temples were carved, they were imagined in the rhythmic breathing of the tides. There is no civilization older than water, and in it, the vibrations of voices lost, not silenced, but submerged, still echo, waiting for those who can hear not just with ears, but with the inner tide of the soul. Atlantis is not a question of archaeology, but of resonance. It is the word we give to a memory the ocean never relinquished, a civilization not entirely lost, but absorbed. When we speak of Atlantis, we are not just invoking a sunken city. We are activating a symbol encrypted in the soul's molecular memory. Its architecture may no longer stand, but its vibration still rises like mist from the waves. The Atlantean myth is a psychic code, a spiritual fossil preserved in the liquidity of being, not meant to be excavated, but evoked. And every time we dream of strange columns beneath the sea, of luminous halls and submerged sanctuaries, we are brushing against a frequency that the planet itself still hums beneath the threshold of waking life. The oceans are not mute. They are choirs, and their songs are not only of salt and storm, but of memory. They carry the grief of planetary shifts, the joy of vanished rituals, and the unresolved yearning of civilizations that once aligned more closely with the stars than with stone. To listen to the sea is to listen to a language before language, to a gospel older than any scripture, one written in movement, in vibration, in water's sacred refusal to forget. To swim in the sea is to swim in a dream that never ended. And when one closes their eyes beneath the surface, sound no longer travels in words, but in pulses, rhythms, ancestral cadences that bypass thought and enter directly into sensation. This is how the ocean speaks. It does not argue, it does not explain. It vibrates, and every vibration carries the memory of something that was never quite lost, only transmuted into tone, into molecular music. Water is not just a physical medium. It is a psychic mirror, the very interface between worlds. There are no straight lines in water. There are spirals, currents, whirlpools. And so, too, is the memory of the soul, not filed in sequence, but layered in flow. What the oceans still remember is not history as we define it, but feeling as the universe defines it. Feeling as frequency, emotion as continuity. That is why the great trauma of past civilizations, their sudden vanishings, their betrayals of light, their collapses into silence, still ripples through the sea like ghostly harmonics. The Atlantean descent was not only tectonic, it was vibrational. A shift in consciousness before a shift in geography. And that shift was absorbed not only by the Earth's crust, but by her bloodstream, the oceanic circulatory system of the planet's soul. Masaru Emoto glimpsed the sacred alphabet within the waters. Crystals formed in response to love and hate, music and prayer, revealing that water listens. It listens and responds, not passively but intelligently, which means the oceans have been listening all along. To our myths, to our violence, to our lullabies, every chemical trace left by human and pre-human existence, every mineral dissolved in ancient blood, every echo of breath from beings no longer named, has remained suspended in this vast aquatic archive. What fossilizes in stone becomes inert, but what dissolves in water becomes living memory. And it is here that spirituality returns not as dogma, but as resonance, a quiet remembrance that the sacred is not static, but fluid. Bachelard, too, understood this when he wrote that water dreams. But it does not only dream, it hosts our dreams. All those nocturnal visions of floods, of drowning, of marine cities aglow with unnatural light. They are not mere projections of the mind, but invitations. Invitations to re-enter the collective dream from which we once awoke too soon. Perhaps we were not meant to forget the sound of light beneath the waves. Perhaps the recurring dreams of ancient seas are not about the past, but about the part of the self still submerged in it. Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu. These are not only mythologies, they're internal continents. They're emotional geographies. And within every drop of salt water that touches our skin, there's a trace of those lost coordinates, still waiting to be re-inhabited from within. There's a salt within tears that mirrors the salt of the sea, not merely in chemistry, but in origin. To weep is to leak the ocean inside us, the inner tide that remembers. And in those tears lies the residue of what the earth has cried to. Her submerged temples, her drowned forests, her civilizations that never carved stone but shaped consciousness. They all echo through the salinity of grief. Salt is the earth's sacred wound, crystallized. Every coastline is a threshold between what remains and what once was. Every wave carries the vibration of an undone prayer. The Urantia Book tells us that the continents have danced, risen and fallen, shaped not just by tectonic forces, but by celestial orchestration. The planetary body has memory, and water is its most transparent keeper. Beneath the Mariana Trench, deeper than the deepest breath, there are silences that hold truths no text can transcribe. These are the vaults of planetary reverie, where even time moves differently, not in linear succession, but in concentric echoes. And the soul, when quieted, can sometimes hear them, in the hush of a shell, in the rhythm of one's blood, in dreams wet with forgotten meanings. What is Atlantis but a code? Not merely of sunken lands, but of sunken parts of us. The luminous, priestly self, the communal resonance, the civilization that did not build monuments to the ego, but altars to unity. Blavatsky knew this. She knew Atlantis not as a place, but as a phase, a frequency once attained and then betrayed. Its sinking is mirrored in us every time we choose dissonance over harmony, power over presence. Yet like all true symbols, Atlantis is not just a loss, it is a promise. That which has gone under can rise again, not through excavation, but through remembrance. To remember, then, is not to retrieve facts, but to restore frequency. To feel the ocean and not just study it. To honor the salt of our tears as offerings to something older than sorrow. A grief that is not hopeless, but sacred. The ocean is not asking us to decode it, but to feel with it. To become water again. Flexible, deep, receptive. To swim inward until we touch the submerged temples within our own hearts. For there are cathedrals under our skin made of liquid light, and within them, the waves still whisper the first songs of earth. And perhaps that is what the oceans still remember. Not just what was lost, but what can still be found when silence meets surrender. Chapter 11. The Soul's Paleontology. Not all fossils are buried in stone. Some are layered in silence, pressed beneath decades of unlived emotions and untold truths. The soul, like the earth, stratifies experience, forming sedimented memories, compacted meanings, and impressions hardened by time. Beneath the surface of every human being lies a personal geology, where epics of joy and grief, light and shadow, form the inner landscape of what we have survived and forgotten. To walk inward is to excavate, but we do not dig with shovels. We dig with dreams, with questions, with tears that soften the ancient clay of our becoming. The soul's paleontology is not a science of remnants, but of reverberations. Its task is not to display relics behind glass, but to reawaken what lies dormant within bone, breath, and belief. Each buried grief, each layer of shame or wonder, becomes part of an inner terrain that still pulses, though hidden. Even those moments we thought we had discarded, a look, a word, a silence, are not lost. They remain, waiting beneath the crust of consciousness, marked like sacred glyphs. The Urantia Book speaks of the progressive evolution of the mind as a sacred inheritance, shaped not only by what we know, but by what we carry unconsciously. The mind, in its ascent, builds bridges between the visible and the veiled, the remembered and the archetypal. Jung called these deeper imprints archetypes, primordial images fossilized within the psyche, recurring across cultures not because they are learned, but because they are remembered. They are the fossils of the soul's journey through lifetimes of longing. We are not merely born. We emerge from layers of soul memory. We do not simply grow, we unearth. Every act of introspection is an archaeological gesture, a brushing away of the dust of distraction, a peering into the cracks where forgotten meanings reside. The depression that lingers, the fear we cannot name, the longing that burns without a clear object, all are clues to deeper layers. These are not pathologies, but pathways, not disorders, but doorways. The soul, like the earth, reveals herself slowly to those who are patient and reverent. And so, healing is not always about rising. Sometimes it is about digging gently. It is about placing our hands into the warm, ancient soil of ourselves and finding the broken pottery of past selves, the jawbones of ancient decisions, the crystalline shards of insight left behind like breadcrumbs in the dark. And when we begin to touch those layers, we do not only discover who we were, we begin to remember what we are. What appears as dysfunction in the surface life is often the echo of something ancient and unspoken. Emotional fossilization does not occur by accident, but by necessity, a protective gesture of the psyche in the face of what cannot yet be held. The soul buries what would otherwise fragment us, not to forget, but to preserve, not to erase, but to return later when we are strong enough to remember with grace. This is the sacred rhythm of inner time, not linear, but spiraled, cyclical, like layers of sediment compressing and waiting to be read. Jung taught that the unconscious is not a vault of discarded memories, but a living repository of symbols, shadows, and seeds. It is a topography of the unseen self, where archetypes lie like bones beneath the mind's surface. The hero, the mother, the wounder, the seeker, each one echoing through generations, asking to be remembered not with intellect, but with integration. These psychic fossils are not there to be cataloged, but to be felt, reanimated, danced with. They're the oldest language we speak without words, carried from soul to soul across the centuries. When Viktor Frankl spoke of meaning as a survival mechanism, he was brushing dust off one of the deepest fossils of the human condition. That pain, when framed by purpose, can become sacred. The act of searching for meaning in suffering is itself a spiritual excavation. To sit with our grief, to trace its contours without fleeing, is to place our hands into the mineral depths of the self. Healing does not always erupt like sunlight through storm clouds. Sometimes it seeps upward, like groundwater rising from forgotten wells. Sometimes the soul's restoration requires not transcendence, but descent, not wings, but roots. And what of therapy, prayer, silence, and sacred rituals? They are not simply practices, they are instruments of excavation. They invite us to dig not for answers, but for awareness. To uncover not explanations, but presence. Like spiritual archaeologists, we return to the same sites of inner desolation again and again, with gentler hands and clearer hearts, until one day, something shines through the dust. Not a solution, but a symbol. Not a cure, but a connection. And we weep, not because we are broken, but because we have found something ancient that still loves us. The Urantia Book speaks of the mind as a bridge between material reality and spiritual destiny, a living matrix through which truth can be progressively unveiled. But for that unveiling to occur, the sediment of fear, dogma, and distraction must be gently brushed aside. The soul remembers, not with the brain, but with resonance. The layers are not gone, they are merely waiting. The soul does not forget. It layers, it sediments. It compacts pain into pearls of insight and seals trauma into geological veins that run beneath every choice, every dream, every hesitation. Sometimes we tremble and cannot explain why. We call it fear, but it is often memory, not of what happened in this life, but of what was never given closure in another. The past is not behind us, but beneath us. The healing we seek is not a leap forward, but a descent inward, a slow uncovering of ancient meanings fossilized within our being. Ivanhoe once wrote that the soul speaks in symbols because words are too crude for the language of eternity. This is why the oldest truths are never shouted. They are whispered through myths, carried in dreams, hidden in archetypes. The soul leaves clues in poetry, in gesture, in longing. These are the fossil imprints of our deeper story, the ones that no history book can archive, yet every tear knows. The feminine archetype of the wounded healer, the exiled sage, the buried child. These are not mere metaphors, but psychic fossils pressing against the surface of our becoming. As we descend into the inner earth of the self, we come to realize that healing is not linear, nor is it final. It is recursive, like the work of a paleontologist returning to the same site with finer tools, each time discovering subtler truths. One year, we unearth the bone of abandonment. The next, we discover the muscle of forgiveness wrapped around it. And still later, We realized there was always a heart pulsing beneath the ruins, not dead, only dormant, waiting for our attention to reawaken its rhythm. The Urantia Book reminds us that the mind is an evolving instrument, progressively refined to reflect greater realities. But the soul is the canvas upon which these realities are etched. Its history is not made of empires and timelines, but of choices, loves, losses, and awakenings. Our task is not to erase the past, but to retrieve the wisdom it buried, to reframe what once fractured us into something that fortifies us. This is the paleontology of the spirit, the art of uncovering sacred meaning in the sediment of human experience. And when we finally rise from our inner excavations, dusty and trembling and whole, we do not emerge as someone new. We return as someone original, not restored to innocence, but initiated into presence. We carry the fossils of our soul not as burdens, but as blessings. And through us, the ancient world breathes again, not in ruins, but in revelation. Chapter 12, The Shattered Revelation. Revelation is not a thunder that breaks the sky once and for all. It is a whisper shattered into time. It does not fail. It fractures. It enters the world not as a monument, but as a mirror broken on impact, scattered into myths, dreams, scriptures, and silence. Each fragment reflects a piece of the divine, distorted by the curve of culture, bent by belief, veiled by fear. Yet none are false. They are incomplete. The sacred does not vanish when misinterpreted. It waits in the ruins of misunderstanding for eyes ready to see again. Urantia has known 5 great revelations, each one descending like dew, meant to awaken something long asleep. But each, too, was clothed in human cloth, handled by hands not yet clean, interpreted through minds still bound to shadow. The planetary prince came, and the rebellion shattered the clarity of that light. Adam and Eve walked in beauty, and their noble plan was lost to haste and hunger. Melchizedek sowed truth in the fields of faith, and men built fences around it. Jesus came not as a king, but as a flame, and still they crowned him with thorns. And now, the 5th revelation stands quietly in the corners of our age, barely recognized, already fractured by the same human longing that once demanded certainty over surrender. But there is no failure in the path of revelation, only unfolding, only return. Teilhard de Chardin saw this, that all truth bends forward, converging beyond its own distortion. Even when we break the message, we preserve its scent. Even when we lose the original light, we walk its echoes. The fracture is not the end. It is the form the divine takes to teach us how to listen again. For we are not merely recipients of revelation. We are its translators, its stewards, its mirrors. The divine truth is too vast to arrive whole into a world of halves. It splits not to be destroyed, but to be sought. The mystics knew this. The Sufis danced it. Gurdjieff carved it into discipline. Simone Weil wept with it. The truth must hide to be loved. It must be veiled so we may long. That is not deception, it is divine pedagogy. A revelation that does not shatter cannot be rediscovered, and only what is rediscovered becomes truly ours. There is a sacred mathematics to fragmentation, a divine geometry that allows the whole to express itself through the broken. Each shattered piece is not a loss, but an invitation, not a tragedy, but a test. Will we seek the pattern within the pieces, or mourn only the missing whole? The error, the distortion, the human misstep, all become part of the teaching. Revelation is not sterile. It risks love, and love, when it walks through time, must pass through misunderstanding. This too is holy. The 5 epical revelations of Urantia, far from linear transmissions of truth, were spirals, descending in a matter, consciousness, culture, then rising again through memory, myth, and soul. Each arrived with luminous clarity, only to meet the filters of wounded minds and fractured civilizations. But those very distortions have kept the revelations alive by embedding them into stories, rituals, symbols, and questions that refuse to die. The misinterpretations are not the enemy of truth, they are its soil. For what the soul forgets too quickly, it does not value. What it loses and rediscovers, it learns to love. There is a paradox that spiritual maturity must embrace. The divine does not always speak in clarity. Sometimes it speaks in riddles, in ruins, in the spaces between words. That is why the 5th revelation, the Urantia Papers, appears so obscure, so hidden from the mainstream, so protected by its own complexity. It is not a failure of reach. It is a calibration of timing. The deeper truths are veiled until we become the kind of beings who can hold them without twisting them into weapons. Teilhard spoke of a planetary convergence, a future in which all fragments would find their alignment. But that alignment cannot be forced, it must be longed for. Each soul must participate in the reassembly of meaning, not by memorizing doctrines, but by embodying wisdom, not by worshiping the fragments, but by intuiting the whole they once formed. The broken mirror of revelation does not call us to despair. It invites us to become artisans of reintegration, to take what history scattered and turn it into music. In this brokenness, there is purpose, a divine strategy, not of deception, but of gradual awakening. The truth, when too luminous, can blind. That is why revelation, to be fruitful, must be veiled in partiality, encased in culture, folded into myth, softened by metaphor. It must speak the language of the age while transcending it. It must wear the garments of its time, and yet carry the scent of eternity. Even the Master, when he walked among us, spoke in parables, in silence, in gestures. His was not a revelation shouted, but one lived, one felt, one quietly ignited in the hearts of those who could hear. The Sufi mystics understood. Truth is not merely to be told, it is to be tasted. Simone Weil whispered that real truth burns, dislocates, hollows, not because it is cruel, but because it demands room within us. And Gurdjieff, with his unsettling gaze, reminded us that human nature resists what would liberate it. Revelation fragments because we are not yet whole enough to bear its full weight. It hides because we have not yet become seekers. It breaks so that we may learn and mend. And still, revelation never truly vanishes. It lives on in unexpected places, in lullabies that carry ancient wisdom, in architecture that whispers of sacred proportions, in symbols that stir forgotten memories. It survives in the very longing for it. The hunger for something more, something deeper, something real, is itself a residue of the divine presence. The shattered revelation is not an absence, but a scattering. Each piece is hidden in plain sight, waiting for a heart brave enough to gather them. So let us become gatherers of light, not to rebuild the past, but to reimagine the future. Let's learn to read what was never written, to hear what was never spoken, to remember what was never taught. For the revelation was never meant to be preserved, it was meant to be lived. And in living it, in trembling faith and in perfect love, we become the revelation ourselves, not as keepers of doctrine, but as carriers of fire. And the fragments, once feared as signs of failure, are revealed for what they truly are, seeds. Chapter 13, Ghosts of the Golden Ages. There are longings that have no name, and yet they return with the constancy of tides. A subtle ache that lives beneath the surface of ordinary days. An ache for something never known and yet intimately remembered. Many carry it without understanding, confusing it with nostalgia, romanticism, or even restlessness. But it is older than memory, deeper than culture, and more persistent than reason. It is the mourning of something beautiful that once was, and perhaps still is, just beyond the veil of this world's forgetting. This ache, this ghostly pull toward a golden elsewhere, has whispered to poets and prophets alike. Plato called it Atlantis. Others have named it Mu, Lemuria, Eden. But none of these are the point. They are doorways. What matters is not the geography, but the gravity. The soul feels it. It remembers not maps, but atmospheres. It recalls not architecture, but harmony. Not chronology, but vibration. Somewhere within, we remember a time when life was not fractured, when spirit and matter danced without shame, when light had not yet been broken into competing creeds. The Golden Age is not merely a myth told by ancients. It is an archetype etched into the human spirit. It is the echo of unity before separation, of simplicity before complexity drowned us. Perhaps we never lived those eras with our feet, but we did with our essence. The soul is not bound to this lifetime, nor is memory limited to the personal. There are deeper strata of remembrance, sedimented not in the brain, but in the very field of consciousness that surrounds and permeates us. And sometimes, under the right silence, the right sorrow, or the right sky, these memories shimmer through like mirages from a homeland we cannot name. This is not fantasy. It is spiritual inheritance. The book of Urantia speaks of ages of light and glory that came and went before our current history even began. Rudolf Steiner spoke of planetary memory in epochs when humanity was closer to the divine rhythm. Henry Corbin, in his mystical scholarship, named the imaginal world, not imaginary, but real in a higher octave, where archetypal memories reside. And Rumi, with the tenderness of one who has seen, simply whispered, "You were born with wings. Why prefer to crawl through life?" His words were not metaphors, they were memories. There are whispers that do not pass through the ears, but rather stir in the marrow. A haunting sense that something sacred was left behind not by accident, but by necessity. This is not merely about lost lands or sunken cities. Though such images serve as anchors for what cannot be seen. It is about a spiritual coherence that once enveloped humanity, when knowledge was wisdom and wisdom was love. That tapestry unraveled not in a single cataclysm, but over eons, each thread pulled by pride, forgetfulness, and fear, until what remained was history, a map without the terrain it once represented. And yet, the terrain is not gone. It is veiled, folded inward, like a dream sleeping in the folds of the soul. These ghosts of golden ages, civilizations built not with bricks, but with frequencies, not ruled by conquest, but by consonance, continue to pulse beneath the surface of our collective psyche. They rise not as facts in textbooks, but as longings in meditation, as visions and dreams, as songs that make us weep though we cannot explain why. They move through the Akasha, that subtle field where every event, thought, and revelation is stored not in time, but in tone. What if these civilizations did not fall, but simply withdrew? What if they became transparent to the eyes of a world, descending into materialism, hiding not out of fear, but out of mercy, to preserve their vibration for a future time when we might once again be ready to listen? There are teachings scattered across cultures of teachers who vanished, temples that faded, and knowledge that was taken up rather than lost. The Lemurians, the Andites, the Atlanteans, these names, whatever their historical anchoring, point to the same remembrance, that the earth once breathed in harmony with heaven, and that some part of us still knows how to return. This is the sacred ache, the grief of the soul, not for something it failed to attain, but for something it once embodied. The ancient sages did not mourn the future. They mourned the forgetting. And in that mourning, they planted seeds of poetry, of myth, of ritual, each one a breadcrumb for the way back home. These golden ages are not behind us in linear time. They're ahead of us in spiritual maturity. The soul remembers not by looking back, but by waking up. We do not merely inherit biology, we inherit resonance. The soul, though born in the present, is seeded with echoes. Some of those echoes carry the vibration of lost harmonies, when humanity walked not above the earth, but within it, as if the ground itself breathed in rhythm with our steps. And perhaps that is why we weep when we hear certain flutes, or why a language never learned can seem familiar when spoken in dreams. The soul remembers what the mind cannot translate. There are no ruins of these golden ages in the sand, only ruins within us. And they do not call for excavation, but for invocation. To return is not to reconstruct temples or summon past technologies, but to reawaken the inner architecture of sacred simplicity. In a world addicted to information, what was lost was not data, but depth. The ancient civilizations of light were not superior because they knew more. They were radiant because they knew less but knew it wholly. Their sciences were silences. Their truths were living presences. They prayed not to something, but as something, as vessels of a divine memory that had not yet fragmented into dogma. And when these civilizations faded, whether by flood or forgetfulness, their departure was not a failure, but a planting. Each vanished age left behind a ghost, and each ghost is not a shadow, but a whisper, not of what was, but of what still could be. The age of gold was not an era to be dated, but a quality of being, an inner climate in which the divine and the human walk side by side. And if it haunts us, it is only because it is not gone. It is waiting, buried not in soil, but in soul. So we walk forward, strangely nostalgic for a future that looks like a past we never lived. Because perhaps, in truth, we have lived it before and will live it again once we learn not to seek it in history, but to become it in heart. That is the work now. Not to reclaim a kingdom lost in time, but to become the very light we are longing for. And when enough of us do, the ghosts of the golden ages will no longer be ghosts. They will rise, not as monuments, but as movements of the spirit, quietly rebuilding the world from within. Chapter 14. The return is not backwards. There is a strange seduction in nostalgia, a pull towards something that feels safer because it is known, or at least imagined to be. In the collective heart of humanity, the idea of return often wears the mask of regression. We long for Eden, for Lemuria, for the Golden Age, as though redemption lies in a backward step. But what if the return is not a turning around, but a moving through? What if the light we seek in the past is only visible because it casts its shadow forward? The soul does not move in circles, though it may spiral. It learns, forgets, remembers, and refines. The evolution of the spirit is not a climb nor a retreat, but a deepening, a widening spiral that embraces the past, not to recreate it, but to reintegrate it in a higher octave. In that sense, the true return is not to what was, but to what always was meant to be. The vibrations of ancient wisdom do not call us backward. They invite us upward. Their resonance remains, not in geography, but in geometry, in the sacred configurations of thought, feeling, and frequency that can be reassembled when the heart is ready. What was once lived purely in instinct must now be chosen in consciousness. This is the alchemy of return, to take what was natural in the child soul of civilization and awaken it in the adult spirit of a mature humanity. It is not enough to remember. We must transform the memory. For memory alone, when stagnant, becomes nostalgia. But memory in motion becomes evolution. The earth remembers her own becoming, not to relive it, but to offer a map. And the sacred task of a human being is to read that map, not with the eyes of the archaeologist, but with the intuition of the midwife. We are not here to preserve the past in glass cases. We are here to birth what the past carried in seed, and to bring it to bloom in a soil the ancients never touched. The soil of our present consciousness, alive, cracked, imperfect, but fertile with longing. To return, truly, is to reintegrate the echoes of what once was into the silence of what is becoming. The past is not a destination to which the soul must retreat, but a foundation layered in myth, in memory, in dream, upon which the architecture of tomorrow is silently built. Those who hear the call to return are not being summoned to repeat, but to complete. And what must be completed is not an age, not a civilization, but an intention, an unfinished vibration that still pulses in the undercurrent of the human journey. Nietzsche spoke of the eternal return, not as mere repetition, but as a cosmic affirmation, a yes to existence so deep that one would live the same life over and over, joyfully. But the Urantia revelation gently refines this. Life is not a closed circle, but an unfolding spiral. Evolution does not trap us in recurrence. It lifts us through resonance. The soul does not come back to where it began. It ascends, carrying the gifts and wounds of each passage, integrating, transmuting, remembering in new tones. There are those who confuse spiritual return with geographic pilgrimage, who seek to walk the lands of the ancients as if the stones could restore their inner wholeness. But the vibration of return is not locked in place. It is unlocked in presence. The Lemuria we long for, the Eden we romanticize, are not places to be found, but states to be embodied. The garden was not lost. It was internalized. It waits not in time or space, but in vibration, frequency, availability of soul. The earth herself has never asked us to go backward. Her seasons do not regress. Her rivers do not flow uphill. What she models is sacred continuity, not return. The rain that falls today once evaporated from a sea that touched ancient shores, but does not fall the same. It carries the memory of oceans, yes, but it nourishes the seeds of now. To remember is not to regress. It is to reweave. The soul does not crave nostalgia. It seeks integration. That which we perceive as longing for a past age is, in truth, the stirring of an eternal element still alive within us, waiting not for repetition, but for recognition. We do not return to Lemuria by rebuilding temples under the sea. We return by embodying the wisdom that once flowed through its invisible priesthood, the kind that walked barefoot not on sand, but through silence. The past is not a shrine to be preserved, but a fire to be carried. The flames of former revelations flicker in every act of awareness, in each breath made holy by attention. Time, as the Urantia text teaches, is not a cage but a classroom. Every epoch, even those veiled in myth or dismissed by archaeology, exist not to be revisited as tourists of memory, but to be fulfilled by carriers of essence. The future is not a destination disconnected from antiquity, but the full flowering of seeds planted in sacred soil. What if remembering is not a backward glance, but a forward movement born from inner stillness? What if the ache for the golden ages is not about going back, but about reclaiming the luminous thread that runs through all time? That thread, shimmering like breath on the mirror of the infinite, is not linear. It spirals, dances, returns not to repeat, but to redeem. Aurobindo once said the evolution of man is not yet complete, that we are but bridges, and perhaps that is our task, not to mourn what was, nor to fear what comes, but to become the very path by which the past transmutes into presence, and the present becomes fertile ground for a future unseen, yet profoundly felt. And so we return, not to where we began, but to who we truly are. Chapter 15, The Light We Inherited. There are no ruins more sacred than the embers that endure, not the temples swallowed by sand, nor the scripts dissolved by time, but the unburnt spark that breathes still in the inner silence of those who remember without knowing why. We are not the heirs of forgotten cities. We are the descendants of their intention. Not the architecture, but the fire. Not the symbols, but the frequency. It was never the monuments that carried the revelation. It was the soul. The great forgetting, then, is not the tragedy. The tragedy would be to lose the capacity to feel what once was whispered through stars and wind and breath. The invisible scriptures carved not on stone, but on the inner walls of being. Revelation is not an event that happened. It is a current that continues. A golden river beneath the surface of our forgetting, waiting to be touched not by excavation, but by awakening. This is the light we inherited, not knowledge to display, but remembrance to embody. What survived was not the clarity of their maps, but the purity of their yearning. A yearning that we now feel when a certain line of poetry stirs us, when a dream echoes a shape not seen in this world, when the quiet asks us to listen as if the cosmos were breathing a name we almost recognize. This is the evidence, not fossilized but felt, not proven but lived. The Urantia texts speak of the indwelling thought adjuster, the divine presence seated within each mind, guiding us not as a voice of command, but as a pulse of truth. It is this fragment of eternity that binds us to all those who came before, not through bloodlines or timelines, but through the sacred continuity of intention. The light we inherited is not passed like inheritance, but awakened like memory. We do not own it, we become it. What we carry is not a flame to be flaunted, but a warmth to be lived. It does not roar, it glows. It does not demand, it invites. It is the soft insistence of the divine within us, the light of the thought adjuster not as doctrine, but as direction, not telling us where to go, but tuning our being to remember how to walk with grace. There are no commandments written in fire, only invitations whispered in stillness. Become who you truly are. To inherit light is not to possess truth, but to be shaped by it. The Andites once moved across continents not only with genetics, but with melodies of memory, tones of spiritual clarity that etch themselves into the soul fields of the earth. Their legacy is not recorded in stones, but in our silent longings, Those unexplainable moments when something ancient stirs in the chest, as if the future were calling from the deep past through us. That vibration is not nostalgia. It is continuity. And the continuity is not chronological. It is vibrational. The light we inherited is not linear. It is luminous. It appears when a child suddenly speaks with wisdom that should not yet belong to them. It flickers when the heart trembles at beauty unexplainable. It burns steady when, amid the collapse of meaning, a soul stands and says, "I remember," even if they do not remember what. For remembering is not about content, but about condition. It is the stance of the soul facing the eternal. So many of the ancient ones left no writings, not because they had nothing to say, but because they trusted the soul would one day speak it again, not as repetition, but as resurrection. We do not need to reconstruct their cities. We need to continue their silence, to sit within the vibration they left and allow it to shape our gaze, our choices, our prayers. Revelation is never extinct, only untranslated. Perhaps the greatest legacy of light is not knowledge, but orientation. It does not dictate our steps. It illumines the direction toward which our inner compass trembles. The civilizations that vanished, the temples that crumbled, the names lost to the winds, none of these were failures. They were flares in a long night of becoming, each one briefly illuminating a facet of the divine we are still learning to embody. And their light did not die with their dust. It passed through the unseen, into us. To be human is to be entrusted with remnants of stars and syllables of the unspoken. Our veins carry the minerals of ancient waters, and our dreams echo architectures we've never seen, but somehow recognize. This is the inheritance, not a map, but a magnet. Not commandments, but callings. The celestial whisper that says, "You are part of a great remembering." And not everything will be remembered at once. Some truths must be grown into. The adjuster of thought, as the Urantia Book describes, is not a mere spiritual presence, but a silent sculptor of eternity within time. That divine fragment does not shout. It waits, like a seed waits for rain, like a star waits for the sky to be dark enough to be seen. And we are that sky. We are the condition in which light becomes visible again. We are not its source, but we are its opening. So let us stop searching for the lost temples. Let us become them. Let us walk not in the footsteps of the ancient ones, but in their frequency. Let us pray not to statues, but with our lives. Let us become living altars to what never died, only withdrew, to be remembered, not rebuilt. The light we inherited is not a story to be repeated. It is a presence to be lived. It is already inside us, pulsing in the silence between thoughts, burning in the ache for something beautiful we cannot name. And that ache, that is how we know the light never left. The end is never an end. It is the moment when the current, having twisted through caves of memory and deserts of forgetting, emerges again. Not where it began, but where it was always meant to arrive. And even now, as you reach the final page, the river is not closing. It is opening beneath your feet. Because truth does not stand still. It flows. And so do you. Time, so often mistaken for a straight road, is a river with spirals, tributaries, and hidden depths. What we thought was behind us often reappears ahead, but transfigured. This is not repetition. It is revelation in motion. The soul does not move in lines. It spirals like galaxies. It bends like water. It remembers like a dream half-lived. You are not separate from the current. You are its witness, its carrier, its continuation. All that you have read, the lost civilizations, the fractured revelations, the cosmic origins, and whispered futures. None of it was history. It was water in your hands. And even when it seemed to slip away, it was soaking into you, leaving sediments of meaning you will feel long after the text fades. What seemed like information was always invitation. The river did not come to teach. It came to remind. There is no final destination for what was never meant to arrive, only to flow. The ancient ones knew this. They carved no conclusions into stone, only rhythms into temples and silence into myths. The Tao does not end because it never begins. It reveals itself like mist over water, not by approaching, but by remembering. The earth has always been listening. Beneath your feet, tectonic memories shift. In the wind, forgotten prayers swirl. And in the rivers, the rivers, the spirit of all who have ever searched, wept, loved, or longed still echoes. The ocean is not the graveyard of time. It is the womb of resonance. Everything you thought had vanished has only changed form. The lost is not lost. It is waiting, singing in a frequency only the open soul can hear. You have not been wandering in vain. Every step was heard by the cosmos. Every question whispered into the dark was caught by something vast and kind. You were never alone on this path, not because others walked with you, but because life itself was the path. Every revelation that shattered was a mirror redirecting you inward. Every era that collapsed was soil for a subtler future. Every silence was the river learning your name. The soul is not a destination, but a confluence. You are not a fixed being. You are a stream of becoming, shaped by remembrance, smoothed by surrender, carried by currents that long preceded you. What you call intuition is the whisper of that river within. What you call longing is its tide pulling you home. Even your silence is part of its song, a pause between sacred notes. And now, the river flows through you, not metaphorically, but truly. Your body a vessel, your breath a ripple, your consciousness a tributary of the infinite. The revelations did not end. They only changed their course. They entered new languages, wore new symbols, and found new listeners. You are one of them. You are not a seeker. You are a continuation, not a pilgrim at the end of the road, but the next verse in a cosmic hymn. Do not search for the river outside you. Be still, and you will feel it moving through your ribs. Be quiet, and you will hear its ancient voice echo in your dreams. Be present, and you will realize the great truths are not lost. They are alive, swimming just beneath the surface of your own awareness. The river of spirit has never stopped. It flows here now, always, and today it bears your name. And if this river stirred something in you, then please leave a trace of your soul here. Comment where you're from. Let the current know who it has reached. Share this with someone whose heart still remembers what history forgot. And subscribe to the channel, because every day we bring new videos to nourish the soul and awaken the ancient light flowing silently within you.